There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. And another We in Other Words. This is an occasional series. I'm trying to make it less occasional, where I talk about word origins and etymologies and all that good stuff, based on vocabulary that I find in my reading. Here's one thing that I forget to mention almost always, which is there is a playlist of all 60 plus, 70 plus episodes I've made of In Other Words over the 5 years or more that I've been making it, so that link is in the show notes. The first word today is from this Tibetan short story collection, which I started almost a year ago. I've read half of it, but I haven't picked it up in months, which is the story of my life with too much of my reading, and it's a project I have for what remains of 2024 to get that under control, or something akin to control. The Handsome Monk by Tsering Döndrup, and it's translated from the Tibetan by Christopher Peacock. I think one of the reasons that I got waylaid with this, in addition to the fact that I just, my reading life is out of control, is there was one really long, almost novella-length story with a protagonist that I couldn't stand. And that really, it was really easy to not pick the book up because of that. But in any event, one of the stories, and in fact it was the story about that guy, the verb strut occurs, and he's in prison for a time, and the prison guard is strutting along the wall. Now, I know what strut means, and I'm sure you know what strut means. You may even be a strutter like me, but I wondered about the etymology, so here is my report. The verb entered English in the early 16th century. Of course, it means to walk in a vain, important manner, to walk with affected dignity, and that meaning, originally in Middle English, strouten meant to display one's clothes proudly, vainly flaunt fine attire. And I guess I do that from a seated position whenever I debut a new blouse on my Friday Reads. And that Middle English verb dates back to the late 14th century. Earlier, in Old English, strutian meant to stick out, protrude, bulge, or swell. And it's going to be really difficult for me to avoid all the double entendres now that we're getting into stiff, swelling, and bulging out. But there is no clear connection between it and any of the naughty words that I'm sure I'm not the only one at this moment thinking of. But certainly the idea of a swelled head, swelling with pride, fits. Going back to Proto-Germanic, Dutch, German, and the Proto-Indo-European root is stir, which I'll get into, and it means stiff. And again, there are no erection-related words that I've been able to find that descend from this Proto-Indo-European root. So, sorry to disappoint. There is a noun that I think probably you've heard of that came into English in the late 16th century, meaning strut as a supporting brace. Yeah, it's pretty common, I think, even today. In carpentry and whatnot. But there is a noun form for that proud way of walking. It exists in the noun form since about the year 1600. So the idea of a stiff way of walking that's kind of egotistical, that makes sense. There are a bunch of other words that are pretty interesting that descend from that same Proto-Indo-European root, stir. Cholesterol. You can see the sterol that goes back to stir. I looked a little bit into that. I didn't go too far, but it had something to do originally with the gallbladder that would become hard because of cholesterol. I didn't go any farther down than that. Starch. Stare. A hard, stiff look on your face. Looking at somebody in a hard, stiff way. Stark. Stark naked. Start. Startle. Starve. Where your bones stick out, because you are starving. Here's one that interested me. Stereo, which is a suffix. We use the word stereo for the old way we used to listen to music, but that is actually, etymologically speaking, that's a suffix, which is stereophonic. And I did go down a little bit of a rabbit hole because how does that go back to the Proto-Indo-European root that means stiff? So I'll take you down that rabbit hole a little ways. The concept of stiffness or firmness can be metaphorically extended to describe the quality of sound produced by stereo systems. Stereo systems create an impression of spatial depth and three-dimensionality. I'm not telling you anything about stereo technology that you didn't already know, but that helps to make the link how it goes back to stiff. When you listen to something on a stereo, it feels like it's coming from different directions, which is what creates this spatial illusion of depth. And that immersive quality metaphorically links to the spatiality of stereo sound connects to the stiffness or firmness inherent in the Proto-Indo-European root ster. So now you know. The next word is hidebound, and I encountered it in a wonderful biography I've been reading for almost a year, in fact almost exactly a year, about the British writer Mary Wesley, called Wild Mary, A Life of Mary Wesley by Patrick Marnham. It's another book that has fallen victim to how constipated my current reads has become. The last time I picked it up, maybe 6 weeks ago. I'm really enjoying it. I really should. I think I started it for People April last year. I should make it as a goal to try and finish it for People April this year. But in any event, Mary Wesley describes her family. Her maiden name was Farmer, but spelled Farmar. That's her maiden name. And she described the Farmer family as being hidebound. I don't think I actually knew what it meant, because it's not a word that I've encountered all that often in my reading. And it means being unwilling or unable to change because of tradition or convention. So basically it means really conservative. Traditional, stubbornly conservative, and so on. Why does hidebound mean that? Well, it comes from two words, which I don't think I need to. I think you can gather. Hide and bound, which is the past tense of bind, the verb bind. The original meaning of the adjective hidebound was to emaciated cattle with their skin sticking closely to their backbone and ribs. And that transformed metaphorically into this idea of being restricted, like the skin restricted their skeleton, or restricted their movement, to being restricted by narrow attitudes, or obstinately being set in opinion, stubborn. Breaking down the two parts of the word, hide, the noun, meaning skin of a large animal, has been with us since Old English, and for whatever reason, the online etymology dictionary that I rely on a lot to prepare this video series, in this case doesn't say when these words came into English, but you can guess it goes way back if it was entered in Old English, and it was spelled Hyd. Goes back to Proto-Germanic, Old Norse, Old Frisian, Middle Dutch, Old High German, German, and goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root skew, if that's a correct pronunciation. And I had never thought of it consciously, but it does make sense that it is also, skew is also the relate of the verb to hide, with the sense of covering. If you're covered with something, you are hiding. So those two are very closely related. So let's talk about skew. The Proto-Indo-European root, skew, means to cover or to conceal. And there's a whole bunch of interesting words that descend from skew. One of them is cunnilingus. And I'm going to let you do your own due diligence on that one, because I don't even really know what it is. Another interesting one, custody, to be covered or protected by. Cuticle, that makes sense, to cover. Hoard, to be covered with your possessions. Huddle, hose, like pantyhose, I think, is that meaning of hose. Hut, lederhosen. Obscure. Obscure originally meant gloomy. The more modern meaning of being rare and not very well known descends from the original meaning of gloomy and covered by clouds. Scum! I was going to try not to talk about Donald Trump in this video, so that means froth and foam, so covers the water, right? And sky. Sky descends from the same Proto-Indo-European root. Bind. The Old English form of that was bindan, meaning to tie up with bonds, and that could be literal or figurative, or to make captive, to cover with dressings and bandages. Going back through all those same older languages, Proto-Germanic, Old Saxon, Old Norse, Old Frisian, German, Gothic, and the Proto-Indo-European root for bind is bhendh, if that's how it's pronounced, which meant to bind. We get a whole bunch of other interesting words from it, including the word bend. This is interesting. The original meaning of the word bend was, when you go way, way back, because it now means to bend, to curve, but it went back to a bow and arrow, and you'd bend the piece of wood, the strip of wood, for the express purpose of binding it with the piece of string, whatever that's called. So that's how bend relates to bind. Bandanna, that makes sense. Band, obviously. Bond, bundle. Cummerbund. Now, I have always pronounced it cummerbund, but I think it's probably not pronounced that way, but that makes sense. Ribbon. So there you go. And the last word today comes from this wonderful Mexican novel called Home Reading Service by Fabio Morábito, translated from the Spanish by Bauer. And I read this for a discussion with Anna Bailey Karras for her podcast, Books on the Go. I'll put a link to that podcast episode in the show notes. This was a really interesting novel that I really enjoyed. And declaim is the word. I encountered it in this novel in noun form, declamation, but it goes back to the verb declaim. It's really at the heart of this novel because, without going down into the weeds of the plot, the protagonist is sentenced because of a car accident that he was at fault for. He was sentenced to community service to read to the elderly and the handicapped, and then he gets roped into participating in a literary salon, and he is disgusted by the fact that all the other readers at this literary salon are reciting their poetry, not their poetry, reciting the poetry they were asked to read, Wordsworth or whoever, Shakespeare, whoever it was, to recite it, that they recite it from memory. And he's really angry that they are declaiming, not reading. And that ends up being a thematic strand of this fascinating novel that was just going to take you places you didn't ever expect to go. I was curious about declaim. So declaim, the verb, entered English in the late 14th century, meaning to practice oratory, to make a formal speech or oration. And went back to the old French, declamer. I don't know how to pronounce it. Declamer. Latin, I won't try to pronounce it. There it is. And going back, I think this is also the Latin, clamare, or clamare, which meant to cry or shout. And the Proto-Indo-European root is kele. I don't know how it's pronounced, which means to shout. In English, it was first spelled declaim this way, but because of its cousin word claim and its spelling, it was spelled like the word claim. From the late 18th century, in English, declaim meant to speak aloud passionately, to appeal to the emotions of the crowd. So that's the sense in which it's being used in this novel. Let's look at the verb claim. It came into the English at the very beginning of the 14th century, meaning to call out, to ask or demand. And that went back to Old French, that clamare, clamare, the Latin, also going back to the same Proto-Indo-European root. So declaim, with that other spelling, came into English in a separate branch of the same etymological family tree as claim did. One of the common ways we use it now is the meaning of to maintain as true, to assert a belief or opinion, and that meaning didn't come into English until the mid-19th century. The noun form of claim, a demand of a right, came early 14th century and goes back to the same Proto-Indo-European root. So let's look at kele, the Proto-Indo-European root, meaning to shout. There's a whole bunch of interesting words that come from that same root. And all the claim words, so we've got acclaim, claim, declaim, disclaim, and there's more, like calendar, clairvoyance, clamor, clarify, clarinet, clarion, declared, ecclesiastic, hall, nomenclature, and reconcile. Oh my goodness. So I now proclaim that this episode of In Other Words is at an end. Thanks for watching.